We do touch on some heavy topics, and you can always check the description for more details on this episode. The TURTZED podcast and content in this episode is presented solely for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. Neither I nor my guests are healthcare or mental health care providers, and we are not licensed or authorized to provide professional medical advice. For more information, please see our policy at TURTZED.com. It's been a little cold here in Florida, a cool 71. So obviously I've been wearing a sweatshirt, which was really helpful in keeping me warm, but it hit a tattoo that's really important to me. It reminds me that perfection is the enemy of the good. And frankly, that's exactly what it says, but it's in French because it comes from a Voltaire saying. So when I went to record this podcast and wanted to make it perfect for all of you at home, I forced myself painstakingly to record the perfect scripted version of episode 1. And after 4 versions with 50 to 90 snippets per version, I can safely say it didn't work. Now, what's funny about this is I'm normally the person that says, give me the mic and point me in the right direction. But my insecurities got the better of me, and so I created a scripted episode. Needless to say, I got the point across, but it felt more like a memoir than a conversation. And a conversation is exactly what I want to be here having with you today. So I'm doing what I do best and throwing out the script, starting over with about 12 hours before I launch this podcast. And if you hear people in the background, it's my mom and Ed, because I had to have someone else here. Otherwise, I would feel crazy talking to myself. So here we go. I'm grabbing the mic and I've pointed myself in the right direction. Hi, I'm Charlie, and welcome to TURTZED, the podcast. You might be asking yourself, great, what's this all about? And honestly, I would be here asking myself the same question. And my answer is, who's to say? I can't tell you what you're going to resonate with or what's going to impact your life, but I will tell you that it's my mission to share my journey authentically with you and what I've learned along the way. I also want to share this space with other incredible people who will share their journey, as well as discuss the modalities that have helped us affect change in our lives. And yes, I know modalities sound so official, but honestly, if you asked me a year ago if I'd be researching somatic breathing or what crystals do for you, I wouldn't have believed it. And I know there are quite a few people listening thinking, okay, he was my boss and a hardcore sales closer. What the fuck is happening? So for now, let's get into it. And by the end of this podcast, you'll know a little bit more about me and what this is all about. But some history is needed first, and the content I'm going to discuss is my point of view as Charlie Turtz. And I am by no means a medical professional, although after 15 years of therapy with some great health insurance, I've basically spent more than the cost of going to medical school myself. So therapy is not required. But if you're struggling yourself, you should seek medical attention, and this is my story of how I knew I needed help. I've been a proud therapy enthusiast, at least 99% of the time, since 2010, and I've definitely put in the work over the past 14 years. There was a turning point for me in 2021 when I found myself on the shower floor, water streaming over me, crying so hard I could barely breathe. It was a really dark place. The darkest of dark, the most desperate of places, and I'm sure many of you can identify with that place that I'm talking about. But it was also the point where I realized something had to change. Because right after you smack down, wrung out, and with nothing left, there is something inside you, this tug upwards, this teeth-gritting reserve of strength where you say to yourself, I'm not doing this again. I'm not getting to this place again. And I'm not putting myself in this situation again. This is my turnaround moment. So when I started my therapy journey 14 years ago, it was because I found myself in a similar place. I was completely heartbroken and destitute, counting down the night's hours, literally praying in a way I've never prayed before. I prayed that I'd make it till morning, that I'd see another sunrise, and that frankly, I would make it until 7 a.m. when I could finally call my mom without scaring the shit out of her. It was at that point that I recognized in myself that if I didn't get help, I would drown. And like a child thrown into the deep end of a swimming pool, trying to learn to swim, I frantically grabbed at the walls. I was looking for safety, except there's no safety in life, folks. There is something else. It's self-discovery. And when you're open to it and ask the right questions, my God, how you can grow and we can grow. I just shared one of the most uncomfortable moments I've had in my life. And you might be sitting there saying, I can relate to this. And on some level, we all have our problems, but what now? And that's a great question. Have you ever painted a picture in your mind of what you thought your life should look like, only to get completely disappointed and hung up on this idea? Have you let the picture that you created in your mind push you down a path where you wake up one day and think, what the fuck am I doing here? Well, I 100% have, and I've done it more than once. So for me, I'm willing to acknowledge it here and now. And whether or not you want to acknowledge it yourself, many of us have been in this place. So I'm going to speak for me and say, it was a fairy tale love story. My grandparents met at a dance when they were teenagers, and my grandfather saw her from across the dance floor, and they literally spent the next 70 years holding each other's hands. There was that one exception when they were on a break because my grandfather was sick, and the only thing that would cure him was some Florida vitamin D, but I'll save the tea on that story until we know each other a little better. On the other hand, my parents' marriage was not quite so romantic. That was more of a psychological thriller than a love story, and it set the stage for a lot of the toxic situations I had myself in. But for so long, I clung on to this idea that I would get my forever love story. The white picket fence, a black and white Range Rover, kids, the dogs, the whole 9 yards. And then I realized that I was chasing this picture that I had in my head, and I had no fucking clue what I actually wanted. Now, you're probably thinking, get the fuck out of here. You mean your head, heart, and your actions can all be out of alignment? Yes, unfortunately, that's exactly what I'm saying. And there is not a chiropractor in the world that can adjust you back into alignment. Yeah, I know that was really fucking dramatic, but I'm going to get more dramatic. So, have you ever noticed yourself rooting for the underdog in the movie? The one that's misunderstood, overlooked, the one that's coming from behind. Now, do you notice that feeling in your chest when that character finally turns the tables and the truth comes out? Or they show their true badass self, take on the giant, and they come out swinging? Yeah, I loved Legally Blonde too, but the overarching feeling is watching someone overcome adversity, being bigger than their situation and finding their voice and being totally unafraid to use it. And that, my friends, is what we all want. The bridge from where we are to where we want to go. And it's a road I've traveled, absolutely barefoot and bleeding, but I'm here today to talk about it. I feel like I finally found my voice. And yes, I know, Charlie, you've always had a voice, but this is a different one. It's my authentic voice. I'm not trying to hide anything, and I'm laying it all out on the line. So what I want to do on this podcast is make it my personal mission to also help you get there too. I want to have real talk. I want to talk about shared experiences and get into some down and dirty conversations with some absolutely incredible people. As you might have noticed, today's Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2024, and I chose this day to launch this project because I felt like this podcast is going to be the beginning of a 70-year love story that I'm writing in real time for myself, showing up exactly as who I am and authentically sharing my journey to the best of my abilities. Now, if you're like me and struggle with the hallmark nature of Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, even a birthday, this idea of gushing love and appreciation only on this single day for people who deserve it every day, then no, you're not a cynical bastard. Or not entirely, but I'm here for it if you are. You're just red flagging something that feels inauthentic, and that's your inner voice talking. It's already guiding you. Well, now that I've got you talking to yourself too, join me in this commitment for showing up for yourself on the daily. Do the things that make you happy, light you up, and move you forward, because that's life's journey, and it's the whole fucking point of why we're here. I'm so excited to be doing this with all of you, and today I'm rewriting what Valentine's Day means for us, right here and right now. And no, not just because I play by my own rules, but because in redefining today as a day we celebrate the love we have for ourselves, and yes, of course, the ones we're in love with too, I'm not totally dead inside, it can become a mile marker for reflection of how far we've come, what we've survived, and who it has made us on the other side. I want you to take a second and think about these questions. Who are you? How do you show up in the world? And how do you get where you want to be? Yeah, I know you're like, well, fuck, Charlie, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't still be listening to this. Well, guess what? There isn't a crystal ball, but we all possess the ability to put in the work and make changes in our lives. Even if it's one step at a time, it's one step at a time. My intention and my commitment to you is to show up each week on TURTZED as Charlie. Flaws, failures, fuck-ups, and everything in between, to share my journey in the hopes that it inspires others to join me along the way and share their journey. Because I believe we learn most from our failures, because if we can be open and honest about them, not only can it help us understand what we could do differently, but as we discuss it on a podcast, it can also help others too. And don't worry, we already have some amazing guests lined up. You don't have to listen to me monologuing week over week, but I wanted to lay the foundation of who I am. So with this as the intention, I want to create a space where everyone can participate wherever you are in the world, because the only requirement here is that you show up authentically and precisely as you are. And after 15 years of therapy, I feel like I'm starting to show my authentic self. And thank fucking God, because if not, it would be one more relationship I didn't cut off early enough. So jump in the boat with me and let's build some deeper connections. I'm a big why person. And if you've ever worked with me and come to me with a problem, you know I'm going to ask why until we get to the root of the problem. So before we start with more stories and all the tea that comes with it, let's dive into my roots. One of the first gifts I received was the book The Way Things Work by David McCulley and Neil Ardley. And unbeknownst to me, that book would shape how I looked at the outside world, and it's influenced me throughout my life. Ironically, despite the knowledge of the outside world and looking at the way things worked outside, I had absolutely no insight into myself. It's only recently that I started to understand how I worked and why, which for the last 35 years prevented me from showing up authentically. At points in my life, I had so many different versions of myself, I could barely keep track of who I was with different people. The one exception, my colleagues. At work, I was consistent. I was presented with facts. I could see how things worked. I created action plans, made emotionless decisions, crushed goals. Work gave me a sense of purpose, and I was completely addicted to it, frankly, because it distracted me from everything else in my life. My self-esteem was directly correlated to the success in my professional life, the plans, the execution, the accomplishments, and when it didn't work out, I disassociated. My anxiety would go through the roof, and the only way to get rid of it was to figure out a way to accomplish another goal. It was so bad that I've had multiple bosses put in my performance review. There's an area of opportunity that you can take time to celebrate your wins and not just move on to the next challenge. Well, if you knew me 5 years ago, you'd know I absolutely did not listen because I thought to myself, who cares? I'm crushing these goals. I continue to push myself harder. I convinced myself that each summit that I climbed, each goal that I achieved, that business Charlie might finally pour over to personal Charlie, and he too could have the life that he dreamed of. Well, that's not what happened. And what I couldn't understand was why the more business peaks I climbed to, the deeper I fell into the personal valleys, and my self-esteem felt like a zero-sum game. Since childhood, my perceived self-esteem and lack of emotions were interpreted as heartless and cold, when in fact I had more emotions than I knew what to do with, and they scared the shit out of me. I would focus my energy on others' needs and keep my own emotions bottled up. I was so afraid that I would misdirect my emotions, and I desperately wanted to prevent mine from misfiring, because misfired emotions were a big part of my early childhood. So instead, I isolated myself, I got quieter, I showed less, and I continued to feel more and more misunderstood. We know traumas cause pain and take away our sense of safety and power, but they also create a deep sense of shame, and shame is crippling. Throughout the process of reclaiming my power and regaining control of my life, there were countless times I nearly gave up because the ebbs felt too overwhelming and the flows too out of control. Before we continue down that path, I want to define my use of the word trauma throughout my work with all of you and my upcoming posts and podcasts. The Oxford Dictionary defines trauma as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. It can be physical, mental, or emotional. Each trauma is unique, and each victim is affected differently. What's really important is an understanding that we cannot and will not always understand, nor have we lived another person's traumatic experience. We all feel and experience things uniquely, and there's no code or standardized means of grading, assessing, or understanding what one person experiences as distressing or disturbing. What is really important is that we grow in compassion for it, allow space and understanding for those who have struggled or are struggling with something, and learn as a society and as individuals how to help both ourselves and others through it. Throughout my own early trauma, I would argue with myself that my life was good enough, that it could have been worse, and that I was still one of the lucky ones. All these justifications do is silence feelings, stifle emotions, and trample on one's voice. Just because you rationalize something away does not diminish the impact it has on you, and doing so will make you feel hopeless. Somewhere in my own hopelessness, there was a tiny ember that repeatedly pushed me to be honest about what wasn't right and where I wanted to be. It created a fire that refused to allow me to give up on myself. And frankly, at times, I'm not even sure how it pushed me to do that. But one step at a time, I climbed closer to finding my voice, my authority, and my autonomy. How? Because I knew that each step up was better than where I had been. In seeking therapy throughout the years, I have found an incredible team that met me where I was. They really listened and ultimately saw me for me. They gave me the space to be exactly who I was, and they helped me to understand that the trauma I experienced wasn't my fault, to let go of the shame I held onto, and to recognize feelings of intense emotions are likely sparked more by the past than they are the present. In these emotion-filled moments, I had to learn to pause, take a deep breath, and this helped me to prevent misdirected emotions that could cause pain to others and ultimately create new traumas, repeat patterns, and bring more shame to myself. The more I understood the way I worked, the more I now believe for the first time that I have the autonomy and can fight that gravitational pull towards those who ultimately trigger me. I seek out trustworthy people because feeling seen and heard has to be mutual as we share our authenticity and vulnerabilities. These new connections bring new levels of belonging to personal Charlie, allowing business Charlie to take a deep breath and enjoy a healthier balance in achieving goals. Success is no longer needed to maintain my self-worth, and the scales continue to balance between personal and business Charlie as a new chapter begins. Simply Charlie, no caveat. Now, I know for some of you that might have been a lot, and I totally get it. We all have a journey that we go through, and for me, it was easier to understand things cognitively until I could reconnect to my emotions. But all of this had to come from one step at a time. If you take anything away from this today, I want you to know that there is support out there. It may not be exactly where you thought it would come from, but it's all about finding the right team that can meet you where you are in the moment. As you tune in each week, my hope is that you're going to hear more stories, mine and others, that will resonate with you. And not just in the way of, yeah, someone did that to me, or I've had my heart broken too. I want to make it more than that. I want to talk about the patterns, understanding the concepts, seeing where else it applies in your life. I want to open our eyes to the connections we didn't even realize were there. As I said, I want to be as open and honest as possible. I want to continue to share my stories to build a good foundation for where I've been and how I got to this podcast today. However, I didn't want to overwhelm you on the first date, so let's go on a few more as we get to know each other. Then we can start inviting our friends and family into this conversation. And tune in next week as we tackle my name change to Turtz. And no, you didn't miss a wedding, just another way that I'm finding my own path in life. And let's just say, I don't regret changing my name for 1 second. Have you ever had an almost deja vu moment when the situation feels so familiar but the players are different? or a gut feeling you ignore because it feels almost safe and comfortable because you've experienced it before, even though it's far from being safe. For me, the more I hid my authenticity and tried to fit in, the more the same patterns would repeat in my life. And it wasn't until I started to identify the similarities between the situations, including my early childhood, that I started to really understand why the same things were happening over and over again. Hi, I'm Charlie, and welcome back to TURTZED. I want to start with a huge thank you to everyone who listened to episode 1 and are back or joining us for the first time for episode 2. To say I was overwhelmed is an understatement. The love and support I received after the first episode truly blew my mind and warmed my heart. I literally got to dinner that night and could barely put 2 words together to place the order, and it's gotten me so excited and really ignited the fire in me to keep going. I'm so excited to dive further into authenticity with all of you, and it was definitely a Valentine's Day to remember, and I can't say that I've said that before. From an early age, I was pushed into the mold of what I should be instead of figuring out who I was. My father would often criticize me and say things like, "I liked your last haircut better," or after I worked all summer at my first job and saving up enough money to purchase my first pair of expensive sunglasses that I had my eyes on for this entire summer, and I was so proud of them, he handed me a pair of sunglasses in the car and said, "Try these on," meaning his. "They'll look better on you." This doesn't surprise me because when we would visit his parents, we had to comb our hair a certain way or wear the clothes that they deemed appropriate. Even if my father didn't directly express his disapproval, I always knew it was there. There was so much said with tone, facial expressions, and body language. Honestly, it was more of what wasn't being said than what was. Someone recently asked me this question as I was developing TURTZED. They said, if you could go back in your life and you had the choice to repeat your trauma, would you? It stopped me dead in my tracks as I remembered the traumas I had experienced because they began to race through my mind. Before I could even answer the question, I had tears welling up in my eyes, and the tears were representative of the pain that I've been through. But I also started to think about the full picture. And as painful as it was at times, I would not be who I am today without all of my life's experiences. If we look at life as a pendulum and focus on the side it swings to when we're in pain, we can sometimes miss it swinging in the other direction. And frankly, the ability to read what's not being said and understand what people want and need has become my superpower as a coach, and I wouldn't have that gift without the pain I experienced in my childhood and even as an adult. I know this won't apply to every situation, but for me, I try to reflect on the entire picture to better understand my journey, and sometimes the most painful things can have duality and lead to something incredibly positive. And speaking of painful, let's talk about first dates. Have you ever been on a first date and been asked something like, "Do you like camping?" Have you ever lied to a question like this and said yes, only to realize that you'd have to, in this case, sleep in a tent and not shower for 2 days? Same. This is just a small version of changing yourself. And if we're honest, what would be so wrong with an answer of, "Camping hasn't been my thing in the past, but I'd be open to trying it again and see how it goes"? It's honest and vulnerable. It's also harder. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I hate camping, hiking, and going to sleep without a shower after physical activity, so you'd get a hard no from me. But hey, at least I could be authentic with this. Now, let's dive a little further into dating. Imagine now you're spending time with someone you're dating and really like. In my case, we were going out to dinner, we were going to brunch, and my birthday was coming up, so we decided to stay in and cook. Yes, I know, it was really fucking adorable, but wait, there's even more. So after making dinner, we cuddled up on the couch, and he told me that he really liked me, and I was so excited because I felt similarly. Then he continued, "But I could never introduce you to my parents with your pierced ears." As painful as it was to hear, Frankly, I've heard worse, and it seemed easy enough to fix by taking him out. I problem solved that one real quick. But once again, he continued. Or tell them what job you have. You'd have to have a real job. Not where you thought the story was going? Well, that is precisely how blindsided I felt in the moment. Even today, I feel like I have to justify this experience by telling you where I stood on the stacked ranking out of over 300 sales reps at that exact moment. Or the following month that I would become the #1 salesperson in a national company. I was once again being told that my choices, the things that I loved, brought me happiness and that I was so proud of weren't good enough. So there I was, in the moment, feeling like the floor had dropped out from underneath me, still trying to figure out how I could change myself to make this work and trying to imagine who I should be to match this person's desire of who he wanted me to be. Why did I keep trying to change myself? And why did I take this as a challenge to prove him wrong instead of just being the person that I was and move on? It wasn't just my personal life. Even at work, I never felt like I fit in. I never felt good enough. And I remember one quarterly business review that I did where I tried to put a sports reference in because everyone else was doing it, and I sure tried. I hilariously fumbled, sports pun intended, a 1-yard line reference with I was on the 99-yard line with respect to a deal that I was about to close. Everyone laughed, and I was mortified. I could feel myself sink into the chair and just want to scream. I wanted the moment to be over, and it stuck with me that entire quarter. I wanted so badly to prove that moment wrong that quarter, I did over 200% to my quota, and I decided that I had earned the right to be a little bit more authentic as if it was a transaction. Why did I feel like I couldn't be myself in the first place? Changing myself to fit in was far too familiar growing up. It felt like my father viewed me as an extension of himself because if I did what he wanted me to do or acted the way that worked for his vision of me, I would be praised, and therefore I personally would feel value. But it wouldn't last because if I didn't, being ignored would honestly have been a blessing. Instead, I'd be criticized and eviscerated. This is where I learned at a young age I needed to be what people wanted me to be, not who I was inside, in order to remain safe. I sacrificed parts of myself, I gave up on my interests and preferences to avoid not fitting into the mold, and this continued throughout my life, resulting in a tremendous amount of suppressed emotions. As I peeled back the layers in therapy, I realized that the conclusions I made about myself were based on the way I was spoken to and treated. The things I believed were that I had no control, I wasn't good enough, no one cared, no one believed me, and I wasn't safe. These limiting beliefs had me contorting and hiding myself in the hope that I would finally be cared for, good enough, and safe. My inauthenticity led me to experience these patterns over and over again. They came with the same result, and they became increasingly worse and more damaging. And to top it off, I made so many mistakes, one of which was pushing some amazing people away. I would cut them off at even the slightest sign of turbulence because I felt it was the only way to protect myself. I had outsized emotions for what would normally just be a bump in a relationship, and that would make it feel like the world was ending. I didn't communicate. I didn't share my feelings. I feared that the response I would get in return would be the exact same thing I experienced as a child. And I know I hurt people. I know I hurt people I cared for by doing this. And yet, when I was truly being hurt, I stayed for far too long and over-communicated like shouting into an empty cave. How fucked up is that? And this went on for years. And I am so thankful that after reflection and understanding my part in these failed relationships, I could truly be vulnerable, own my part, and apologize in order to rebuild some amazing friendships. And although I began to have a better understanding of my limiting beliefs and was trying to work through them and where they were rooted from, there was something that I couldn't put my finger on. There was something that was still holding me back. Have you ever thought about writing your name? Not just the letters, but what it means for you. What does it represent? What connections to your lineage does it hold? Does it bring you love? Does it bring you anger? Neither had I until I was in my 30s, when I was struggling to write my own name because it didn't feel like mine. It felt like a shadow lurking and a reminder of a life that I wished I could leave behind. There's a quote by William Shakespeare that I have my own personal interpretation of. The quote reads, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet." So if I changed my name to one I felt represented me and my authenticity, would it matter? Would it make a difference? Would it finally give me permission to show up more authentically? I guess for me, subconsciously, it took me out of the shadow and put me into the light. I wanted to start a new path with a name that I felt like fit me. The problem was, no one really knew who I was entirely, and neither did I. However, taking back control of my own name was more empowering than I could have even possibly imagined, and it helped me to continue down the path of finding my authenticity. After years of thinking about it and discussing it with a select few, I made the final decision to change my name. When selecting my last name, I thought about all of those questions I asked you earlier, and selected a name that represented and meant so much to me. I couldn't wait to tell my mom's parents because I knew it would mean a lot to them, but nothing could have prepared me for their response. My grandmother was absolutely elated with the news. She clapped her hands and held them in that interlocking hold with a huge smile on her face and said, "It's about time. I am so excited you're officially going to be a Turtz." If you knew my grandmother, you can picture exactly what that smile on her face looked like. Whenever I saw her, she would have that smile on her face, and you could feel the love and joy just beaming from her. I do have to tell you, I was also the first grandchild, and this created kind of a special bond between us. I loved to push her buttons and jokingly ask her if I was her favorite, to which she would always laugh. And to my family listening, as hard as I pressed, I never really got an answer, so we'll never know because she took that one to the grave. Now, my grandfather always had words, almost all of which came with a strong sense of protection. I always knew I was safe and that he had my back. In fact, even if I felt wronged and then got over it, he would continue to hold that protective grudge, and he took quite a few of those to the grave as well. So when I told him I changed my name, he was speechless. It was like he froze, and as I looked more closely, I realized that he had tears in his eyes. I'm not sure that I had ever seen tears from him before, and I don't think I ever saw them from him again. He held and supported all of us with his strength when we were struggling, and in this moment, I could see that he put that strong exterior aside and no words had to be shared. I knew exactly how he felt, and as it fully processed, he realized that I would have the same name as his father, Charles Turtz. And even to this day, I'm not sure which of us received the gift that day. I wish that conversation solidified my name change, but let me tell you, if you're not changing your name because you got married, the process is long and complicated to say the least. And so is telling the rest of my family. For those of you who don't know, I have a brother, and no, he's not my twin, but I will say guests at his wedding confused me for him. I love him more than anything, and yeah, it's weird to not have the same last name. It was a difficult moment and a very difficult conversation, and I am so thankful that that name change didn't affect anything in our relationship. In my struggle and sadness about having different last names, my brother was supportive and kind despite struggling himself in that moment. He understood my why and knew it had nothing to do with him, and he wanted me to find my own path in life. With my father, I tried to handle the conversation delicately, and I wanted, to the best of my ability, to handle the situation directly and not have him blindsided by the information from someone else. Turns out, it may have been better to stay silent, because I was met with the fury of this is the most hurtful thing you could do, and I would come to regret this. Yet, to the contrary, I haven't looked back. The gag of it all is the idea that I could have an identity outside of him, and that this had nothing to do with him. It didn't seem to compute. It was as if I could never have an identity outside of being my father's son, and that it was wrong to make this choice for my happiness without putting him at the center of the decision. So after yelling at me and then calling my mom to enlist her to convince me not to do this, I had one of my first experiences with holding on to my authenticity and being unafraid to own it by continuing down the Turtz path. My father's reaction to my name change was actually ironic. It highlighted the fact that both a father and son, although for different reasons, each chose their own last name for their personal identities. You see, my father's mother remarried a man who also lost his partner when their collective 4 children were under the age of 5. When I was about 10 years old, I was learning about lineage, and I asked why we didn't have the same name as the rest of his side of the family. And my father explained to me that he chose to keep his biological father's name instead of taking the new family name to keep his own identity. There's a lot in here. And if I could leave you with one thing, it is to be kind and also find your authenticity. Be who you are, even if it's just updating your dating profile and taking out camping. Show up as who you are. It's so much more powerful and, frankly, a way more enjoyable way to live life. And as it turns out, it's not just for authenticity sometimes. You got to have some fun with it too, because, well, have you met me? I'd do anything for a sale. So it turns out, when you start a job with one last name and a phone number from New York, yet a few years later, someone reaches out to you and you have a new last name and a phone number from Florida, it may be hard for that person to tell that they're talking to the same person. So since I had access to both phone numbers and email addresses, what I thought was a clear response to their question, they thought was a handoff to a totally different employee in another state for their relocation. Honest to God, I spent the better part of a week having multiple conversations with someone who thought they were having 2 separate conversations with 2 separate Charlies. And to top it off, they continuously demanded to speak to Charles Turtz's supervisor, who they believed was New York Charlie with my original last name, because they didn't like the answers they were getting. But surprise, they got the same answer from my supervisor because it was still me. Thank you for following along with me today, and I cannot wait for next week. I'm still deciding between 2 topics, so it's going to be just as big of a surprise for me as it will be for all of you, but I can safely say you will not want to miss either one. This isn't exactly what I thought the 3rd episode would be, but this coming out episode actually turned into a 2-parter. It was an emotional episode for me to make, and it took a few recordings to actually get the full thing out, which meant that I had to stitch a few things together. That being said, I am super excited to present you with part 1. Have you ever been referred to as the other one? No? Not sure what I'm talking about? Let's dive in, and I think you'll have a much better understanding. My brother had the sport gene. It was as if he could pick up any sport and push himself harder. And he loved the game. He had soccer, baseball, track, and those were just the official school teams. He was gifted, and I am so proud of how much work he put into those sports. My father spent time coaching him and his teams, and as my brother put in the work, my father would beam. I felt like my brother was the favorite or the closest extension to what my father wanted to be, or maybe just what he thought his son should be. I did play some traditional sports like baseball and soccer, but I didn't love it. I wasn't very good at baseball. I'd be out in the outfield, bored out of my mind doing cartwheels trying to keep myself busy. And even for soccer, which I actually did somewhat like, I never cared about winning. It wasn't my goal, and there I was also found on the field doing cartwheels when the game was happening on the opposite side of the field. I would have rather been doing gymnastics or theater, and even in middle school I wanted to do cheerleading because I was drawn to the stunts in gymnastics. I was proud of my brother and wasn't envious of his sports skills. I wasn't envious of the attention he got from my dad. I just wished that I could get that positive attention for the things that I loved. The better my brother became, the more I wanted to drop out of the things I was doing. The more I dropped out, the less I wanted to be at his games because it was just another reminder to me of where I felt inadequate. I didn't have the skills to communicate why I didn't want to go,
and yet there my brother was, so supportive of me, showing up for things like my Shakespeare production, something I knew he wouldn't have been at if I wasn't part of the theater company. My brother actually supported me more than I remembered my dad showing up.
I was looking for my dad at the ski resort we visited, and in order to try to find him, I went up to the bartender because my dad would often sit with him after skiing, watch sports together, have a drink, and talk. I won't be using the bartender's name, but I will tell you he was one of the nicest guys. I asked him if he knew where my father was, and although he did not necessarily know my younger brother and I as well, I knew that he was aware of who my dad was. He said he hadn't seen him, but if he did, he'd let my father know that I was looking for him. Then he asked me a question. "Are you the soccer player?" I said no because obviously he was referring to my brother. Then before I could say another word, he said, "Oh, you're the other one." I remember leaning over the bar and feeling like someone had just pulled the chair out from under me. I felt like nothing and no one. This man who had spoken with my father countless times had in his mind that my brother was the soccer player and me, I was the other one. Sadly, this wasn't a new feeling. It just felt like more external confirmation of what I already felt inside, that I didn't matter. When I think back to a time in my life where I felt most like my authentic self, before I experienced and understood the prejudice and judgment of the world, I think back to when I was 5. I felt free to be me. I remember feeling pure joy, and I can still hear the laughter of carefree Charlie. In thinking about it now, from a young age, it was pretty obvious that there was a possibility that I was gay. But I so badly didn't want to be different. I had enough trouble just trying to go from day to day, let alone growing up and trying to hide myself more and more every time I felt different. In 7th grade, I tried cheerleading only for 1 month. And for that, I was made fun of, and that carried through from 7th grade all the way to my senior year of high school. Even though, as I said, I only did it for 1 month. It became part of me and defined me. I was that guy that did cheerleading that one time. I was called gay or a faggot countless times in the hallways of high school, and even beat up, shoved against my locker, and hit in the stomach by one of the football players in front of his girlfriend, who I actually knew. And an entire hallway of people witnessed this during the 6-minute class transition time, and not one person said anything. So I kept it to myself, and I tried to pretend that it didn't happen. I quit something that brought me great joy, and I excelled at because I was ridiculed. Even my senior year, when I finally found some courage to join an all-star team in Connecticut with some of my girlfriends from high school, where I felt like I could be in a safe bubble to do something that I loved, I was still terrified to ask my parents if I could do it. I remember coming home and working up my confidence to even ask if I could, and I remembered my dad minimizing it to cost. Why would we pay for that when you're only going to do it for a few months before you go to college? Well, because I fucking wanted to, and it made me happy. Shouldn't that have been enough? I remember my mom supporting me and trying to talk my dad into letting me do it, and all I could think of was if this was my brother, and he was asking to sign up for a sport, the check would have already been written. And frankly, cost-wise, this paled in comparison to the support that they had already provided him for his sports career. I said I wasn't jealous, but if I'm being totally honest, I did feel an emotion. It was anger, and sadly it was misdirected at my brother. I later understood that I was just angry that 2 siblings were being treated differently, and I see now that this resulted in undermining the relationship my brother and I could have had for years. We were in effect put on different teams, and without knowing, we were pitted against each other without the understanding of what was happening and for what, only to be told by our father when we fought that all we would have one day is each other. It was a dichotomy that was so subtle that only recently did my brother and I realize that we felt like we were on opposing teams and had no idea why, when we were both trying to work towards the same goal. It can be hard to stay focused on the path ahead, which is very bright, and not look into the rearview mirror with absolute fury, thinking about how much time we missed out on because of this divide. It's in these moments I feel like I have to be patient and kind to myself because I can't go back and change the past. But what I can control is putting my best foot forward and further growing the bond my brother and I have because we can make up for lost time. So at this point, you're probably asking yourself, how small could you possibly make yourself? And I'm glad you asked. Anytime I felt like I was being my true self and pursuing what made me happy, I felt criticized. I became the simplest version of myself, small and boxed in to protect myself because I couldn't handle showing the world more than the 6 sides of the box I put myself in. And man, that box was small. Simple Charlie, the most basic form that could get through the day without really showing anyone anything, until I met the first guy that I dated.
I remember feeling like I could be myself, and I told him things that I had never told anyone before. I felt connected and really seen for myself for the first time. And when it ended, as I described in episode 1, I could barely pull myself off the floor of the bathroom. And I struggled to get the help I needed because I struggled with the idea of telling my parents I was gay. Instead of telling them, I started therapy. I felt lost and alone because there was no one who knew I was gay, and I didn't want to tell people because I was in distress. I felt that the outside world would be more difficult if I was coming out because I was sad, and telling people while distressed would only be confirming the stereotype that it's harder to be gay. Once again, I had this picture in my mind of what it should be like to tell people I was gay. I wanted it to be when I was happy and in love. And as we all learned in episode 1, that's just not how life fucking works. Nothing is perfect. And while we try to make it easier for people to digest instead of asking for help when I needed it the most, I suffered even more pain. Many years after I came out, I remember watching Call Me By Your Name with a friend. Ironically, we watched it on Valentine's Day. We sat in the back row of the theater, and when the movie ended, neither of us moved. We stared at the screen with tears in our eyes. The movie had so much meaning and felt so relatable. For me, the scene that broke my heart was when he was at the train station and makes the phone call and he says, "Can you come and get me, Mom?" I had been there. It was that moment that I experienced laying on the bathroom floor, completely sad and heartbroken, wishing I knew back then what I came to understand years later, that I could have called my mom. And I wish I had asked for the support to help me start the path of trying to find my authentic self much sooner. If you know my mom, you know that the love she has for me is actually endless, and I'm so thankful for that 99% of the time. Love you, Mom. So why did I struggle for a few more years to tell my parents? I remembered spending an entire session with my therapist who was insistent that my parents would be totally fine, and he couldn't understand why I was so terrified to tell them. This therapist had been recommended to me through a family member, and the therapist continued to push back, making valid points that he knew my family and our views based on his connection, and I fully agreed with him. That was the problem. My discussions with the therapist were so focused on coming out, but what I was really talking about was being afraid of the wrath of my father if he disapproved of me being gay, and his ability to divide our family. Ironically, I actually said to the therapist, no one is going to care, but on the 0.001% chance that my father doesn't approve of this, I could lose everything. I was afraid that if my dad did not approve, my mom might take my dad's side, and my brother would be afraid to choose a side, resulting in me losing my entire support system. Although I can look back now and understand the psychology behind my fear, at that time, I thought I'd rather live my life as a lie than risk losing my mom and my brother because I was in such a dark place. I didn't know how to function without their support, even if it only meant partial support because they didn't know fully what was going on. I want to pause here because I want to go back to something very important and repeat it from the first episode. We all feel and experience things uniquely, and there's no code or standardized means of grading, assessing, or understanding what one person experiences as distressing or disturbing. I know for so many, the things that I feared with the loss of my loved ones, that this becomes their real life, and they really do lose everything and everyone in their life. I cannot imagine the strength it takes to live life authentically under those circumstances. I am so grateful for my family's acceptance when I told them I was gay, and it breaks my heart to know that it could go any other way. My fear didn't come to fruition, but for so many it does. And if that's you listening, I wish I could give you a hug because no one deserves to be treated that way. In fact, my fear was actually not a fear of their reaction. It was displaced fear. The problem with my entire conversation that day with my therapist is that we were so focused on being gay and telling my parents that at no time did we stop to ask, why are you so terrified of your father? I also struggled with coming out because I didn't want being gay to define me and be the only thing that people saw. I was already known as the other one. I felt like I had to fight for my place already because I was pushing myself to be a person I didn't want to be. The last thing I wanted to become was labeled solely as the gay friend, the gay cousin, the gay coworker. I felt like if I was gay, that would be all people would see me as. And I felt like there was more inside, but those parts of me were already dimmed to fit into the mold that kept me safe growing up. But over the last 15 years, like my view on Valentine's Day, coming out isn't like a graduation. It's not something that happens once. Coming out as gay wasn't even 0.01% of it. Most, if not all of us, have parts of ourselves that we try to conceal that often hold shame. If we're honest with ourselves, reflect, and work to push ourselves to become closer to our authentic selves, we can show up each day and transform a little more into our authentic selves. So when I finally decided to tell my parents, it was because I wanted to move to New Jersey. So not really sure where that fits on the spectrum of happy to distressed, but there we were. At that time, I was thinking about moving to New Jersey and needed to tell my parents about New Jersey, but I couldn't tell them just that because it would make no sense without letting them know I wanted to do this because of a friend that I had made who was gay and I wanted to be closer with him. I remember my dad reacting with two statements. The first was, I would rather tell people you're gay than tell them you live in New Jersey. I still to this day am not sure what to make of the statement, but I had to share it because of its absurdity. The second was something I didn't even realize until recently was immensely damaging to me. I still expect you to have a normal life and not become one of those 50-year-old gay men still sleeping with 20-year-olds. Meaning, he expected me to get married and have kids. He was still trying to push me into the idea of what he thinks my life should look like. In the juxtaposition to his response, immediately after I told my mom and my dad, I began to cry. I remember my mom hugging me and telling me that she would love me no matter what, and this didn't change a thing. Even in coming out, something that should be mine, he insisted that I live my life in a way that it would be acceptable to him. That's the incredible thing about coming out authentically. You can take the opportunity to create your own life, and yet here I was, being pushed to still live my life in a way that my father would find acceptable. And so for years, getting married and having kids was the path that I told myself I wanted. I convinced myself that even though I was gay, I still wanted that white picket fence, the black and white cars, 2 kids, and a dog. I'm not really sure what I want at this point, but I know I have the autonomy to design my life the way that feels good to me, and it's a path I'm excited to explore. But for years, I was grasping at these ideas, and anything that I could hold on to keep my life as normal as possible. I think that there are a lot of people who follow society's expectations, such as girls wear pink or boys wear blue, or that they get married and have kids, when in reality that's not who they are authentically. And I wonder whether my father fits into the latter. Today's story isn't over. The second part of my coming out story will be coming next week, and it comes with muted, big emotions. In addition to taking on big emotions, or the lack thereof, with the rest of my coming out story, we'll throw in my 27th birthday surprise and emergency appendectomy, and how it prompted me to tell the rest of the people in my life who didn't know. I will explain how I found myself at a pivotal life or death moment where I felt like the world literally grabbed me and said stop everything and reflect, because there are some decisions that there's no turning back from. So think about what you really want. I want to thank you for listening today. I know that this can be tough, and I know that this is going to resonate in many different ways for many different people. As I said from the beginning, I want to share my most authentic story, and this is part of it. For so much of my life, I've tried to put on a smile and a brave face to keep going, and today, I just had to be my authentic self with this story and tell it exactly how I was feeling. Even in struggling to remember the past emotionally, I know that all of the work that I've put in to better understand these situations has made it a much brighter future, and that's not just a glass half full. Putting in the work has changed the way that I look at the world and the way that I look at myself, and I wouldn't change it for 1 minute. The work makes me feel positive about the future, and sharing this space with the upcoming guests is meant to give you ideas of where you might look for support, more stories that might feel relatable, and ultimately with a goal of feeling like you're not alone. I'm going to start this episode a little differently today. The second part of my coming out story is hard for me to start because I know what is to come, and this episode will go deeper and be more difficult. I heard from you how part 1 resonated and the impact it had on you. There was so much in part 1 that almost no one knew, and yet this episode has more. It has material that not only did I not tell people, but even in therapy, I could barely put it into words until more recently. It was too painful, and it felt like if I spoke about it, it would become real and something I would have to deal with head on. And I'm so thankful that I finally did. This episode of TURTZED discusses depression,
and I want to put that out there right up front because for me there were points in my life when just hearing the word depression would trigger me. It's important for me to share this episode because I am in a good place now, and I hope by sharing my full journey authentically, it may be helpful to hear an important message. We can get through these moments in our lives and get to a better place. So let's get into it. I've struggled to feel emotions since I was a kid. I spent most of the past 35 years ignoring my own feelings and trying to figure out what everyone else was thinking and feeling by their facial expression, their tone, their body language, and what they were not saying. For the last few years, I've been working in therapy to better connect to and understand the emotions that I'm feeling in the moment rather than looking back, because for so long I was so disconnected from all of them, I felt like a computer. In the last episode, I took you back to a time where I felt carefree at 5 years old. It isn't to say that I didn't experience joy after that time, but the waters became muddied. In the early part of my life, I experienced two main emotions, sadness and fear, which began the intense fight or flight instincts that became ingrained in my DNA. As I grew up, I wanted to be prepared for anything. I never wanted to sit with my back to an open space where I couldn't see exits and full visuals. My body language communicated the same thing, closed off and guarded. Much of the time with my arms crossed, sitting in a version of the fetal position without being in a ball on the floor, and always looking around, incapable of making eye contact for the fear that I would miss something. As a child and a teenager, I felt shame and embarrassment for having emotions or expressing needs, hopes, and preferences that didn't align with the views of my father. If I had just become a clone, it would have been easier. I felt that it was my fault that we were not presenting as the perfect Stepford family. I remember trying to portray the image of a kid from Westchester with the perfect family, the clothing, skiing on the weekends, but I struggled to communicate how I was feeling, and I felt like so much of the time my feelings were dismissed by others because I grew up with certain privileges. I started to think that I didn't have the right to my feelings, and that the privileges meant that I had no right to complain about feelings of being diminished, treated differently, being told who to be, and yelled at when I didn't act a certain way, to name a few. I even remember testing out a new therapist, and in our first 30 minutes, they stopped me mid-sentence, and for the first time, I was given permission to feel my feelings when the therapist said, "I'm going to stop you right there. You could have grown up with nothing, and if your father loved you the way you wanted, or any child would have wanted from a parent, you would have been better off." My jaw was on the floor, and I blurted out, "When can we book our next session, and how do I break up with my current therapist?" As I got older, I began to turn on myself, punishing myself emotionally when I didn't fit the mold of the little boy that I thought I had to live up to. I pushed myself to be the perfect version of myself, and a completely inauthentic one, I might add. And under this self-imposed pressure, I would explode when I couldn't meet the unrealistic standards I set for myself, for the fear that if I fell short of those standards, I would end up experiencing something worse than what I was already doing to myself. I felt strong emotions from a young age because I refused to believe that the way I was being treated at home was acceptable, and the more I stood up for myself, the more I was invalidated. Sadness and fear didn't disappear. They were just the first emotions that I became disassociated from, and then in came anger. I'm going to pause here for a definition. According to the National Institute of Health, disassociation is a process linked to lapses of attention, history of abuse or trauma, compromised emotional memory, and a disintegrated sense of self. It is theorized that disassociation stems from avoiding emotional information, especially negative emotion, to protect a fragile psyche. It is amazing what the body will do to survive because as scary as being disassociated from myself has been at times, it is also the thing that I believe saved my life. Have you ever heard the story The Emperor's New Clothes by Hans Christian Andersen? It's the story of a vain emperor who hires two con men who make him a magical outfit, which was really nothing, and he wore the magical outfit in front of the whole city. Well, in this story, the townsfolk are looking at the emperor completely naked, and they all go along with it, and one child raises his hand and says, "But he hasn't got anything on." Have you ever been in a situation where you're looking around thinking, "Am I the only one seeing this?" and everyone else is just going along with it? My father often yelled and screamed at me. I was terrified and afraid, and yet something inside me refused to be diminished, minimized, or erased. I felt like I was holding on by a thread, but I would not give in to what I knew to be wrong. If anyone says to you, because I said so, or I'm your father, you do as I say, take a moment to pause and question whether this has more to do with them than you. I want to pause my story for a second and speak generally about the parent-child relationship. You may have someone in your life whose behaviors include manipulation, deception, projection, anger towards others, and especially when questioned. All of these can be terrifying and make you question everything, and to make matters worse, those who are involved in the situation or witness it can often be gaslighted into staying silent for the fear of retribution and retaliation. Oftentimes, if you've experienced this type of narcissistic abuse, you may find yourself hiding and protecting the narcissist, especially when it is your parent. I mean, what human grows up without the biological instinct to want love from their mother or their father? Growing up, I was the child saying, something isn't right here. And most of the time, it was just me asking why. Why am I going to do that? Why do I have to do it that way? And as I said before, most of the answers I got were because I said so and because you do what your father says. Now, anyone who has met me knows that there is no way that I was going to accept that as an answer, especially when I could find a different and more efficient way to do something. Remember when we talked about gifts? Well, this became mine in business. I always ask myself why. Why are we doing it this way? How can we do it faster? How can we be more efficient? But as a child, I often experienced yelling and anger for questioning my father, and I thought that everyone saw the terrifying fury that would come out of him. And yet no adult stepped in those moments, and to me, it seemed like everyone else acted as if the emperor was speaking in plain monotone vernacular. And as a child, it made me feel like everyone else thought that this was acceptable behavior, and so I came to feel that there was something wrong with me. Once I had dissociated from the sadness and fear because no one was coming to help me or acknowledge my feelings, I became angry. I felt like this child constantly raising my hand saying the emperor isn't wearing any clothes. It felt like it was easier for me to live in anger and fight back against my father's pronouncements like, you can't wear flip-flops to dinner on the beach, which erupted into a full screaming match when I asked why, even though I was terrified and afraid. In my desperate attempt to set boundaries to try to protect myself, my anger grew. I pushed back yelling and screaming, which to an outsider, it might have seemed as if I was the problem and I was impossible. I remember overhearing my father tell my mom that he wanted to send me away because I couldn't be handled. There was even part of me that wanted this to happen so that I could escape. I even tried to will it into existence, loosely talking about getting sent away to a boarding school in the hopes that it might actually happen. There were so many nights I cried myself to sleep hoping I would get sent away or that my mom would leave my dad. As I look back at who I was and how much anger I presented to the world, I'm reminded of a conversation with my mom that I will never forget. I had been yelling angrily and she sat me down and said, if you don't learn to control your anger, you will become him. I fully understand why my mother told me that, and she was right. That would have been possible. She was trying to keep the family together, and she was living in her own fear, and at the time she did what she thought would be best. Instead of stepping in, she told me to calm down and control my anger. I knew that in no way, shape, or form did I want to become him in my life, so we can add a third emotion that I disassociated from: anger. The problem was in my day-to-day, I had shut down sadness and fear, and now anger, and I didn't have any other emotions to fall back on. That's when I turned to work for fulfillment and validation. I poured myself into my work and held on as if I was in the middle of the ocean and work was my life raft. Ironically, my first job was as a lifeguard after getting certified that summer. I was proud to have completed the certification, and I called my parents with excitement to tell them, only to be met with my father asking me, how could I have gotten lifeguard certified when I could barely doggy paddle? In my late teens and early 20s, I had no depth. What you saw was as far as it went. If I was with someone, I could feel their joy and enjoy the time, for the most part, and when that time ended, I went back to being disassociated from everything, crying myself to sleep most nights, not understanding how I got to this place, and how disassociating from my feelings felt like the only way to not become my father, and keep those I cared about safe from me treating them the way that my father treated me. And this went on for years. By the time I turned 27, I was so disconnected from all my emotions, I felt like I was just walking around empty inside, hoping people would talk at me, tell me stories, tell me their problems so I could focus on everything but mine, my emotions, and how I was feeling deep inside. If you asked me a question, I would look for the fastest way to answer so that I could turn around the conversation and bring it back to whomever I was speaking with. Once again, this turned into a gift for sales and understanding the customer's needs, but the toll it took on me became increasingly more and more dangerous. Even though I had told my parents a few years earlier, I fought internally with myself about coming out as gay until right after my 27th birthday. 2 days before that birthday, I was smoking with a friend and it just hit differently. Granted, I hadn't done much of it before, but this time I got stuck in a lucid dream for hours. The dream absolutely terrified me and would for years to come because I felt like I didn't have a grasp on reality and I was watching my worst fears play out. Now I can look back on the dream and not see it as a nightmare, but rather as a message of what my life would look like if I didn't start to make changes. Throughout the night, I felt like I was being punched in the stomach, and it was likely because it was the first time my body allowed me to feel anything in years. The dream ended with me standing on the edge of a building, looking down at the ground. I woke up and thought I was having a heart attack. I rushed myself to the hospital only to be placed in a room and told that I was having a panic attack. I went home, laid in bed, and barely ate the rest of the day, but I was determined to rest because my birthday was the next day. I woke up on October 18th, 2015, and had a strong feeling that something was off, and boy was I right. It turned out to be appendicitis. At the time, I was living with my brother and his now wife, and I told them that I wasn't feeling well and that my stomach hurt, and my brother very politely responded, "Charlie, we're going to go for a walk. It's probably just gas. We'll be back in an hour and go to brunch." We can laugh about it now, but inside I knew something was really wrong, and I went to the urgent care to double check. I have never been seen so quickly at an urgent care. Not only was the doctor pulled from another examination room, but they told me to go to the nearest emergency room because I was likely experiencing acute appendicitis. I was so disassociated at that point I couldn't even feel the physical pain, and 2 blocks later, I was back in the exact same room of the hospital where I had been the day before with the panic attack, being told that there was a serious possibility my appendix would burst, and they couldn't do surgery for at least 6 hours because I had had a protein shake before I got to the hospital. Now, if you know my mother, you can probably imagine the frantic call my brother received from her. She was yelling into the phone, "Do you understand how serious this is? He could die. You have to make sure that the doctor sees him immediately." To which my brother responded, "Mom, he's in a hospital. We will see you soon." At that point, I was still in communication with my father, and his response was not surprising. He told my mom as she was racing for the train to get into the city, "If you get to the hospital and he actually needs surgery, I will come in." I did need the emergency appendectomy, and I believe that surgery that day saved my life in more than one way. Not only did my appendix get removed, but this was the moment where I realized that something was seriously wrong, and it felt like there was a greater power saying, "Stop everything. You need to examine your life because you're making decisions that will affect the rest of your life, and you may choose to do something from which there's no coming back." That was the beginning of what was almost a decade of work to recover from my childhood trauma and the trauma I inflicted on myself consciously and subconsciously throughout my life. After having emergency surgery and spending my birthday in the hospital, I decided that it was time to make some changes, and the first one was coming out officially to those who I hadn't told yet. I spent years in fear and conflicted about coming out, and the stubborn side of me felt like I shouldn't need to do this because if you're straight, you don't have to make this announcement. But this was an important step in the process of starting to come out authentically to people that I loved. At that point, I decided to make my announcement. I didn't know who knew and who didn't know other than my parents and my brother because I had come out at one job but not the one before, or with one group of friends and not the other. Honestly, it was exhausting, and I had to keep everyone in their silo because I didn't know who would tell who if their paths crossed. I didn't even want to think about it, so like I do with every problem, I found the most efficient solution. I wrote a group email to the people I felt needed to know, and as I read it back, it was so devoid of emotion and basically sounded like a business press release, which I guessed was my authenticity at that time. Ironically, though, at the time I wrote it, I actually thought what I wrote was open and filled with feeling and emotion. But I did make one very heartfelt point in my coming out email. I wrote, "Saying I'm gay is worth it because omitting the truth with silence is no way to live and be happy with the loved ones in my life." Rereading the email broke my heart because I can feel the pain of 27-year-old Charlie and the desire to feel seen and understood as well as loved and accepted. Despite my inability to emote and connect in the email, after all, I had been disassociated from my emotions for years. Those who received the email went above and beyond to show me love that meant the world to me and helped me to keep going. And it still does. Their responses were all so beautiful, and although my grandparents are no longer with us, I wanted to share their response, because even in their late 80s, their acceptance and understanding of me was well beyond their and many other generations. What a beautiful statement of your coming out. We are very proud of you for having the strength and determination to write that statement to us. You have always been able to find the right path for yourself, and opening up to us about being gay makes us love and respect you more than ever. You must know that we will always respect your choices in life, and that our hopes and desires for you are that you will always be happy. Our deep love for you has been and always will be boundless. I'm not sure I ever properly thank them and everyone else. And what kills me is that in challenging moments, we can deprive ourselves of connected experience with the ones we love. And for that, I'm deeply sorry, because if the tables were turned, I would have wanted to shower them with love and support. It's easy to say if I knew back then what I know now, I would have done things differently. However, this is part of my journey, and I wouldn't change it. As my brother often paraphrases Maya Angelou by saying that doesn't mean when we know better, we can't do better. I've learned so much from so many incredible professionals for whom I'm very thankful for. And I believe I'm ready to truly come out, and not as gay, yes, everyone knows that. But for me, it means something different now. I'm coming out as my authentic self, because regardless of how you view telling people you're gay, coming out to me means showing up each and every day as you, to the best of your ability, because one of the few things that we have control over in our life is showing up authentically to the best of our ability. And it's so much easier to live that way. In part one of my coming out story, I spoke about laying on the floor of the bathroom, praying that I would be able to make it through the night. I felt like my whole world was crumbling, and I didn't know how to handle it, even though I knew I was in trouble. I called my mom at 7 a.m. on the dot and told her I couldn't make it to graduation, which was less than 4 weeks away. To understand her reaction, you need to know that for the 4 previous years, I worked 40 to 60 hours per week. I finished my undergraduate degree in 3 years and figured out how to make my 4th year count by completing college and my MBA program in a total of 4 years. I thought I could simply tell my mom I was exhausted and needed a break and I wanted to come home. But at the time, I was actually afraid to be alone, and I thought that I was hiding how depressed I was. After episode 3 was released, and nearly 15 years after those events around my graduation, my mom and I had a very emotional conversation in which she told me how alarmed and scared she actually became during that call, and that she thought she was going to lose me that day. She told me that immediately she called her twin brother to ask him if he would speak with me as my uncle, not as a therapist, because she was afraid that after we hung up the phone that I might not make it home. And 15 years ago, I was afraid that I wouldn't make it home either. Sadly, the fear she had was heightened because her own uncle had taken his own life about a year before I was born. I remember getting home and going to my uncle's house and speaking with him for over 3 hours, telling him everything like a floodgate had burst. I don't know what made me do this or how I gained the courage to do this after hiding for almost my entire life. But he listened and gave me a semblance of hope that I could continue with life. I left the conversation feeling loved and hopeful and began therapy the next week. Obviously, my uncle couldn't be my therapist, and I'm so thankful for him and the time he set aside for me that night. When I found out my mom knew how distressed I was, my stomach dropped. I couldn't understand how she could have let me go back to school. That's the thing. We often don't know why people do the things they do. We often don't know what others are thinking, often attribute feelings that are based on inaccurate conclusions we make about ourselves. In this case, no one cared. I struggled to understand and was afraid of the answer, but I asked her anyway.
If you were afraid of the mental state that I was in, why did you let me go back to school? Why didn't you say something? Her answer was simple. Charlie, I was so terrified I was going to lose you, and I didn't know what to do. And in that moment, calling my brother was the only path I could see to keep you safe. He called me after he spoke with you, and although he didn't tell me anything about your conversation, he felt like you could go back to school that day and that you were going to start therapy. I had to trust him because I was afraid that if I said or did anything, that it might upset the balance he had created, and I couldn't live with the possibility of what could happen. I think it's important to understand that these moments of desperation are not as hidden as we think they are. People who love us know they can intuit where we are, and it's one of the hardest positions for someone to be in because there's no playbook to have that conversation. There are so many factors, and everyone's different. I want to open a dialogue because I wish I knew back then what I feel today, which is that I had way more support and love in my life than I realized. It frightens me and still gives me anxiety that I was so convinced that no one cared, no one loved me, and no one believed me. And inside, I felt like there was no point in saying anything to anyone because I was often told that isn't how you feel, or it could be worse. My mom and I have struggled to communicate at times over the years, and it has caused frustration on both sides, but there's always love. There are so many examples of my mom providing me unconditional love, but today, while I go to therapy to better understand myself and find my authenticity, she's putting in the work too. Together, we are working on the way we communicate and shifting to a healthier relationship filled with mutual understanding. I know that it can't be easy for her because it hasn't been easy for me, but the love I have for her taking the harder road and putting in the work and having the difficult conversations in order to become closer is more than I could have ever asked for or imagined. Although in the past I tried to wear a mask of joy and happiness, I have come to understand that I wasn't fooling anyone. I was so disassociated from physically or mentally feeling anything. I refused to let myself believe I could have suicidal thoughts because if I acknowledged it, it would become a reality that I would have to deal with. And I didn't think that I was strong enough to handle that yet. I lived my life afraid to stand on the subway tracks on my way to work, putting myself as far away from the tracks as possible until the train was safely stopped at the station. I wouldn't stand on street corners until the light was ready for me to cross, and I would avoid any media, TV, movies, shows, music that had to do with depression. By staying away from these things, I avoided the feelings of despair and tried to keep myself as safe as I could because I never knew what was going to trigger me. I spent so much of my late teens, 20s, and early 30s trying to change everything about me and my life. I moved, I became friends with different people, I cut my hair differently, I got tattoos, I got piercings, I tried drugs, but the one thing I didn't try was looking inward. It was too painful, and I eventually reached the end of my rope. I was walking home one afternoon, and I felt like I couldn't even control my own mind and body. I tried to get myself to stop on a street corner, and my legs kept moving. I told myself to grab onto a fence, but my arm stayed by my side. I told myself to stop and talk with the doorman, but my lips were sealed shut. As I entered my apartment afraid of what might happen next, I was able to gain the smallest amount of control and called my therapist, and when they didn't answer, I texted, "It's an emergency." And immediately I received a text that said, "I will call you in 15 minutes. I felt like I could take a breath again. I also knew I had a major problem. I felt desperate and alone, but something inside me fought the urge to make a decision that I would not have been able to come back from. I couldn't let those feelings become the end of my story.
In recording this podcast and sharing these stories for the first time publicly, I had to take a minute just now because, as you could hear, I was very emotional and I wanted to make sure that what I say next is incredibly clear. I am so thankful that I can not only look back and reflect, but also share these parts of my story because I no longer feel alone. I'm grateful for the people in my life that have supported me even when I couldn't see or take in their support. I want to continue opening dialogue with people in my life and with my listeners because as we reflect together on the podcast topics, we can build stronger connections with each other and those in our lives. I want to summarize a few things I hope that those listening will take away from this episode. First, depression can feel like it fully takes over your mind, and it can convince you of things that are not reality and are absolutely terrifying. Each person's struggle is unique, and there's no single formula to approach someone who is struggling. But I know that there are many mental health professionals that can help you navigate how to have that conversation. Second, sometimes those who put on the bravest face, seem the most put together, and are helping others can often be the ones struggling in silence. And if you're able to create a safe space for open dialogue, it can provide small and crucial details that might help you to understand how a person is suffering. Third, there are many different resources, modalities, and professionals that can help you build a village of support to work through the dark places and help find a better understanding of self. And finally, don't assume that you know what people are thinking or what motivates them. Come from a place of curiosity and with kindness, ask a question to start an honest conversation. As I've said, my goal with this podcast is to continue to share my stories, the stories of others, as well as bring on professionals to share their practices. I want to share the things that I've learned which have helped me, and I want to continue to create space for open and honest conversations to help those struggling. I'm still learning. I'm still exploring myself. I'm continuing to try new modalities, and each day I try to live a little more authentically. And I try to provide myself a little grace when I fuck up, to create space to apologize and build a stronger relationship with those that are willing to be there in the hard times with mutual love and respect. Thank you for the opportunity to open up and for the kindness along the way. I wanted to share these stories many times for the first time so that you will have context for the next phase of the podcast. That's it for today's episode of TURTZED, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation. Do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe or follow button, because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. And if today's episode got you thinking, laughing, crying, or maybe even rolling your eyes, write a review and tap to rate. Now let's be real. This convo doesn't end here. Hit us up on socials and don't be shy. Slide into our DMs. We love to connect. Thanks for hanging with us today, and catch you on the next one, because our journey together is just getting started. Remember, stay curious, live authentically, and keep turtzing it up.